And so I want us to talk about Native Americans. So the formation of the United States, of course, displaced people. And so the question is, what do the people who are displaced do? How do they react to this displacement? How does, for example, American independence affect Native Americans? And the question of whether what the United States did with Native Americans is or qualifies as genocide. Some people will say it does. Um, but I think we live in Virginia, so we can't talk about divisive concepts, whatever that is. But let's talk about alternative visions in other places. So, for example, amongst Native Americans, so what happens with this expansion? Now, some will say that the United States or the indigenous peoples become colonized. Do they become colonized or displaced? That is up to, I think, interpretation. But one of the changes that we see is initially the British have the 13 colonies. And so those were British colonial subjects. And so those agreements with Native Americans were executed between the British and Native Americans, not the United States. And so when the United States becomes a country officially in 1783, these agreements are no longer in force. And so what will the United States do? So Native Americans stop being British subjects and now they become something. According to the United States, people to remove from where they lived. And so we see some of the reactions are going to look like those in China. So traditional religious leaders, prophets, charismatic leaders, but also rebellion. And if you remember Hong Shikwan, these are the things that he's doing. He's seeing visions. He is engaging in rebellion. And so you see a lot of this. Usman Dan Fodio was also doing the same thing, although he was doing this with Islam as the religion that he pursued. And so you're going to see a couple of things. So for example, Tenskwatawa and his brother Tecumseh and a few other leaders. And we're going to then run into some names that you're going to recognize. So for example, William Henry Harrison. We'll talk about him in just a bit. And so Tenskwatawa, we shall see his strategies. And so he actually talks about cleansing the people so that they return to native or to traditions. And his view is that if his people did this, then they would be able to kick out the British, but also undertake violent resistance. Now, of course, if you're being removed from your land, you kind of, few people go willingly. In places like New Mexico, but New Mexico, you will note, was under the Spanish. In Delaware, you see a shaman, Neolin, and so there's some element of tradition, some element of religion, some element of prophecy, and so all of these are geared towards kicking people out. So U.S. independence, as we mentioned, changes the relationship because it removes the agreements that had been executed with the British. And this was actually very interesting. Last summer, 2024, we were talking to a chief of the Rappahannock Indians. If you ever go to DC, you will see some references to the Rappahannocks. And so their chief was in the UK, maybe 2023, and what she was trying to do is to revive the agreements that the Rappahannock Indians had made with the British, because that was the agreement. Now, the whole United States and how it came into being and how it took over their lands, I think that's a very complicated diplomatic question. But what we know is that as the United States begins to expand, it's expanding and taking up the Ohio River Valley. We mentioned before that initially Native Americans, well, they were removed to west of the Mississippi. And so that was kind of the extent of the United States. But now so that was the extent of the 13 colonies. And now that the United States is a country, it's going to do what expansionist empires do. And so they, for example, are moving the Native Americans from the Ohio River Valley, which of course has to change their way of life. So hunting, actually the bison, the buffalo are near extinction. And so the Shawnee have to kind of give up hunting for farming. But again, think about the homesteaders and the settlers, and they are taking over this land. So what happens to Native Americans? Now, Tenskwatawa was one of those prophets. So he overcomes personal failures and has these religious visions like the other prophets or charismatic leaders that we have seen. And so for him, you can see some of the common features. He has a dream. It features heaven. Virtuous Shawnee people would return to traditional life. And so it's sort of like do away with contact with modernity and the British and now the Americans. And so people who did not do this would suffer in hell. And again, avoid outside influences. So we are going to see this. We saw this with the Taiping Rebellion. We're going to see this with the Boxer Rebellion. So killing of Europeans to try and get them out of, And so if they listen to him, the deer would return, the dead would be resurrected. So that is interesting. But again, think about another prophet who lived in Jerusalem about 2,000 years ago. The dead would be resurrected. So is Christianity really so much different from these Native American religions? And so also evil whites would leave the land and to the west of Appalachia. And so if you are familiar with the US geography, New York, Catskill Mountains, coming down to Virginia, the Blue Ridge Mountains, all the way south to Georgia, the Smoky Mountains. So that's the Appalachia region that especially encompasses West Virginia and the western side of Virginia. And so apparently the Europeans would come back to the east of Appalachia. Kind of didn't happen. So now, of course, the Americans are getting concerned that Tenskwatawa is gaining more followers, and the question is, how do they deal with him? And so again, look at these similarities. These are state or national government. So in this case, the United States, there is a rebellion. So for example, in China, the Qing, and so you see these similarities, and it's useful to keep thinking about how people who are becoming colonized resist colonization or how they react to this colonization. And so William Harrison challenges Tenskwatawa to make the sun stand still. There's an eclipse. And so Tenskwatawa is like, well, you see, I didn't make the sun stand still, but I brought darkness in the middle of the day. But also he is like Hong, he is not, he gets, so his vision is not necessarily universally accepted, and some people are thinking, well, he's too strict. So for example, you can't use alcohol. I think maybe use of alcohol was not a good thing. But so he talked about collaborationists and how that was not a good thing, and maybe they should be murdered. Now, I want to stay for a moment with William Henry Harrison, who was also called Old Tippecanoe. And so he was a military leader, governor eventually of the Indiana Territory. So you see, as the United States expands west, um, future important people are taking the lead. We'll talk about Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears at some point. But so William Henry Harrison was the fifth, I think, president of the United States, but he had been, a number of things like governor, representative in the House of Representatives. He was also a senator, and then he became like the ambassador to Grand Colombia, and then he became president in 1841. He actually has the record of the shortest presidency of exactly 30 days. Said he died from a cold because he walked from the White House to the Capitol, and it was in March, and it was really cold, and he caught a cold, and he eventually died. William Harrison was also the grandfather to Benjamin Harrison, the 23rd president. But so these are the removals, if we might call them that, of Native Americans. And so if you look at the map, I hope you can see the Mississippi. That's the Mississippi. And so initially, Native Americans were moved out of the 13 colonies. You can see the Appalachian Mountains. But then now they are actually being moved further west into what is today Oklahoma. And so a lot of the other territory is unorganized. So, for example, Oregon Country, and yeah, the Little Bighorn. Eventually, and this is quite one of the most famous and celebrated, well, it's really sad, elements of removals of Native Americans. So the Wounded Knee, you will be familiar with Wounded Knee. So this is sort of like the last stand by Native Americans in 1890. And this now moves them into reservations. So again, think about how the United States came to be, and think about where it exists and who used to be there. There are these ideas that because nobody claimed the land, that it was essentially terra nullius, nobody's thing, nobody's soil, and so people just moved in, and this is actually not true. And so Tecumseh dies, or rather Tenskwatawa dies, and his brother Tecumseh, there were actually three brothers, forget the other one's name. And so he spreads his vision to the Great Lakes, and he tries to create this confederation of Native Americans because they have a common enemy, which is kind of the United States. And so again, see what happens with people who are rebelling against the authority of the U.S. government. So William Harrison burned Tenskwatawa's village. And so this kind of makes him discredited, because it's sort of like, well, you said we could fight, and now we are being moved away. But anyway, so Tenskwatawa moves to Canada, he dies, and then his brother Tecumseh becomes the person who is organizing Native Americans. And so because of immigration, and we'll talk about some of this, so white Americans outnumber Native Americans a lot. Again, remember, they die from diseases and lack of hunting grounds and those kinds of things. And so this is where we are talking about, was this ethnic cleansing of indigenous Americans? Can we see this in the same light as what Hernan Cortez does in the Yucatan Peninsula, you know, disease, war. What we can say for sure is that Native Americans are being moved west, and they are being continually encroached upon by an expanding United States. And so they are moved now west of the Ohio River. And so if you think about where Ohio is, and so there were those who thought that maybe resisting the United States was not going to work out very well. And so some moved willingly, others were like, well, let's die fighting. And so you see this being the broad narrative of the expansion of the modern state. It's expanding into people's existing territory. So, and we are going to also see this, for example, in the Yucatan Peninsula, which is the region south of Mexico. This is the region that included especially the Maya. And so Mayans had these civilizations that, again, came into contact with Hernan Cortez, and they are sort of decimated. But now the independent Mexico is going to begin to expand in the Yucatan Peninsula. And so initially, and again, it's important to think about what Mexico looked like these plantations, especially to the north. And so the Mayans are kind of in the area of Honduras, Panama, that region. And so remember that Europeans are going to these places looking for gold. When they do not find gold, they try to find other minerals, but also when they don't, then they begin farming. But the Yucatan Peninsula was kind of left alone. Again, a lot of the New World was not really, there were like absentee landlords. And so the Mayans were able to keep their land for a while until the Mexican state begins to expand. There was a confederacy in that region, but again, you see the Mayans, like Native Americans, retaining some of their political institutions, their traditions. But we are going to see the state expanding there. So their autonomy is beginning to decrease. People are beginning to come in to take over land. And so especially, so the Yucatan Peninsula is kind of near the equator. So it's kind of like parallel to the Caribbean, to Florida. And so these are good places to farm sugar. And so in order to farm sugar, you have to move the people who are there, or to make them work for you. And how do you make them work for you? This was actually a creative way that Europeans did this in places where they didn't just murder people. And so they instituted taxes. Now, if you have to pay a tax, and of course, if you don't pay the tax, then you are arrested and jailed or other things. So to pay the tax, you probably need to work for them. And so you are in debt, and so you're working for them, but the wages are so low. So it's like in making people indebted so that they work for you. Government, of course, is looking for revenue. And so again, where do people get money from? Now, eventually we are going to see rebellion in the Yucatan Peninsula, but also we are going to see the government moving in to crush the rebellion. Just like the US sent William Harrison and Andrew Jackson, we are going to see the Mexican government and local whites kind of going in to try and take over the land. And so again, think about the broader visions of the Europeans. The idea that they were going to move into these places to civilize people. And so even in the Yucatan, like instituting taxes and other things, the story is that we are bringing education and civilization and other things to you. We are creating a nation, and you have to be subjected to the rules of this nation. And so Mayans begin to fight. They get some of the modern weapons, and so they fight the Mexican government, but then eventually they are defeated, as we see with most of these insurgencies. But again, you can see how many of them died, about 30 to 40%, and then we see degeneration into. And so think about, if you sort of think about the Mayans and their rebellion, there are some individuals that come to mind, and one of them is Jose Maria Barrera. And so again, he comes up with this vision, divine encounter, and he has this vision of creating an autonomous polity. Polity is generally a country in the Yucatan Peninsula, but he's trying to do this where the Mexican government has decided this is going to be part of our territory. And so the question is, when you're defeated in war, how do you get some recognition? What is your legal status within this new polity? Now, when we talk about colonialism, well, maybe the more recent version of colonialism, we are going to talk about the loss of identity. So colonial peoples did not have any status. And this is not just actually out there in in Africa and Asia. Native Americans only became American citizens in 1924, which I think is ironic that the people you found there are not American citizens. And they were the first. So this is the presumption of we are coming in and we are going to decide who is a citizen. It's mind-boggling. And so Jose Maria Barrera is trying to figure out what is the Mayan identity. How are the Mayans going to fit into this new dispensation? But again, the Mexican government sends Ignacio Bravo to fight the Mayans. And so by 1900, the Mayan rebellions have been completely subsumed, and most of the remaining Mayans are actually now working for Mexican plantation owners. Later on, we are going to talk about some of these maybe exclusions based on race. And so, for example, Mayans, because they were indigenous Americans, their place in Mexican society and how, for example, people from Spain and people who are born of European descent begin to control politically the development of the Mexican state. And this is not just in Mexico. All the states that will become independent, and I think we saw when they became independent. If not, I will include that slide. But I want us to pivot now to see other places and how these rebellions and colonialism changes society. We have talked about India. The British East India Company, its control of India, and now we are going to see how the British government actually begins colonialism. Now, I also want you to keep in mind this civilization mission. A lot of these governments will say we are moving into civilized people, but really it's almost like they were more invested in exploiting the resources and labor of the people. So, moving to India. So, the British East India Company begins to control much of India, and there are officials of the British East India Company who are living in India. Now, they kind of bring some of their traditions from Britain, including the desire to be recognized as maybe political rulers. And so the British people who were administering India, whether it was during the British East India Company or later on when the British established a colony, were called nabobs or nawabs, which is sort of like viceroy or deputy. And so they do certain things. So, for example, they marry Indian wives, they dress as Indian princes, they wield power. So it's almost like they become these mini powerful people, like warlords. Now, so we have mentioned that the British East India Company, which is formed in 1600, controls India until 1857. There's an event that causes the British government to take over. And this stemmed from a rebellion. So now they were, of course, in charge of the nabobs or nawabs were in charge of extracting labor or managing trade. And India was very productive in terms of spices and cotton and other things. We saw how it was producing lots of cotton before the Industrial Revolution. Now, so nabobs would acquire large fortunes during this period of British rule, and they lived like, princes and so on. But also, it's important to see the attitude that Europeans had towards some of these other places. So, for example, Thomas Macaulay talks about a single shelf of European books being worth more than all the literatures of Asia and Arabia. This is the same Asia that includes China that had all these dynasties. And so this really sort of reinforces the idea that Europeans, the British, see the Indians as backwards. We saw some of the traditions that they were trying to stop, which I think I agreed with them a little. So, for example, sati. But really, these are the colonial attitudes that I think were very destructive. But in 1857, there was a rebellion in India, which is called, well, either the Sepoy Mutiny. Some people call it the First War of Independence. So this rebellion was actually very interesting because the issue was, now it's important to think about the demographics of India, but also think about the religious makeup of India. So Hindus consider cows to be, I'm not certain if they actually consider them to be sacred, but they don't eat them. Yeah. Muslims consider pigs to be unclean. And so if you combine religion and technology, so part of the new technologies are these rifles that need gun oil to lubricate the cartridges. And so the British had discovered that pig fat or cow fat were very useful in lubricating these cartridges, the bullets. And so, the British are like, well, of course we eat cows and we probably eat pigs. What's the big deal? But the sepoys, so the sepoys were the troops that were hired by the British East India Company, were either Muslim or Hindu. And so you at the same simultaneously you're offending two groups. You're offending the Hindus because you are slaughtering cows and using their grease, and you are slaughtering pigs and therefore offending Muslims because, and apparently you had to bite off the edge of the cartridge, so you're technically eating pig or cow. And so the sepoys really kind of disagree with this, and they begin rebellion. But there were other reasons for the rebellion, including taxes and other punishments. And so in 1857, we see the rebellion break out. And part of it is, and you see this with colonialism, so Governor General had absolute legislative power. The British annex kingdoms, they collect taxes, so they are fully oppressing Indians. I guess if there was a place they could have shifted them to, they probably would have done that. And so these treaties, these encroachments, these actions that the British are taking are not welcomed. And now they've gone into the religion and offended soldiers. And so, yeah. But they also, kind of like what the 13 colonies do, they sign treaties and then they violate the treaties. And you're actually going to see a lot of this happen, not just with the British or Native Americans, even in places like Africa, Ethiopia. The Italians sign a treaty with the Ethiopians, and then they are like, well, actually, that was deceptive because there were two versions of the treaty. And one version would say, we are friends. Now, of course, if someone says we are friends, okay, we are friends. But the other treaty would say, we control you. And so when you try to enforce these treaties, people are like, well, I thought we were friends. Why are we fighting? And so the British are doing those kinds of things in India, but they're also trying to do some maybe progressive things like build railroads, telegraph, postal networks, and so on. But all of these things are not necessarily designed to help Indians. In fact, the sole purpose of doing this is to increase productivity, to be able to take the products to market. But so again, although these were not things that people liked, the real cause of the rebellion was the grease of the cartridges. But again, there were these bubbling resentments that were going to eventually come out in the open. But also other things, for example, included inequality in pay. So the British officers were paid more. And, a lot of times they would be the ones who were the bosses and, gave the orders. And so again, it wasn't, there were many reasons. Now, so the rebellion begins in 1857. You don't necessarily need to know all the minutiae of the rebellion, but it's important to know that it begins in 1857. And so you actually see some people arise from that. So, for example, Maulavi Madula Shah calls for British unity. So, again, you see these individuals rise up. Bakht Khan, Devi Singh, and so especially Devi Singh sets himself as a king. So, again, sort of think about Hong Shikwan, think about Tenskwatawa, think about Tecumseh, Usman Dan Fodio. Like there are these people who rise up, they are charismatic leaders, and they are opposing the major power. That might be a question in the future. But so the rebellion is using, like the other rebellions, charismatic, prophetic character that is shared by other anti-colonial, anti-expansionist peoples. And so this is a map of the rebellion. And really, so if you look at the map, you can see the green is where Indians still retained control. So these were sort of like the kingdoms that were allied with the British, but the other town places are what the British controlled. Eventually, they would control everything when they imposed colonialism in 1858. So and this is probably another map of who was fighting on which side. Now again, this is a very, yeah. No need to remember all of this, but it's kind of illustrates, especially the red stuff, is the states or the princes who are allied with the British. Now, there were neutral states, um, yeah, but also this kind of shows us the extent of British control. And if you look to the east, that is the area that is today Burma or Myanmar. Now, so the rebellion kind of goes on for about a year, but this was a series of revolts. So it wasn't like just one rebellion. And so some of the grievances are local, some of them are, so like Devi Shah is trying to become the king of India. And of course, you would have had some examples from the Mughal emperors, but really he was a peasant, and yeah. And so when you sort of think about the way the rebellion goes forth, peasants are claiming the rebellion is theirs. They are destroying property that belongs to the British East India Company. They are attacking native money lenders. And so if you are collaborating, you're the enemy. But again, we see there is not a national vision. Same with Hong Shikwan. He wasn't saying, well, I'm going to replace the Qing Empire and become the ruler. Ken Squatawa and Tecumseh were not saying we are going to create a United States that is made up of Native Americans. And so some of these rebellions, if you sort of think about them, they kind of really didn't have a very good vision. Now, the reason the British actually take over India is this. Um, so when people are in rebellion, sometimes they are punished. And so the way the British East India Company would punish the rebels is they would tie them in front of a cannon and then fire the cannon. And so you can imagine what happens to the person if you're blown apart and they make everybody watch. So that if you're thinking about rebellion and you just saw your friends be fired from the cannon. Now, so this is the British East India Company doing this. Again, remember this is a company, not the British government. But images like this were sent back to Britain, and the British are like, well, that is a little over the top. So maybe we should go in there and establish rule. So actually, the British East India Company is dismantled after this because really, British East India Company and the British government takes over. So during the rebellion, we see the rise of some important people that you've never heard of. For example, Lakshmi Bai, who was Queen of Jhansi. So actually, she was the wife of so her husband Gangadhar Rao died, and so she becomes the queen. And she actually fights the British. They had adopted a son. They didn't have their, I think their own son died, and so she adopted a son, and so she tried to make him the king. There's a fable that she fought the British and she was holed up in this fort, and so when the British approached, she jumped from like really high up onto a horse and rode away, which is kind of the image on the right. Now, eventually she is killed in 1858, but again, she's one of the leaders of the Sepoy Mutiny for something or another. But it's important to sort of think about the heroes of these rebellions, these anti-colonial movements, and how they are celebrated. Actually, the Indians celebrate Lakshmi Bai. She's one of Indian heroes. Now, so as I mentioned, the British response was like, well, this is really brutal, and so maybe we are not going to allow this to continue. So Queen Victoria, who ruled Britain the longest, maybe, or was it Elizabeth? The Victorian era during the Industrial Revolution. So she talks about religious toleration, improvements. Indians would serve in government. And so from about 1858, the British established the civil service. Now, in 1885, one of the civil servants that would come through this system was Mohandas Gandhi, otherwise called Mahatma Gandhi. And so you will know that Mahatma Gandhi is often seen as the father of Indian independence or the Indian nation. He came up with this philosophy of non-violent resistance called Satyagraha. And again, think about how people influence each other. And so Martin Luther King was, well, he wasn't a student of Gandhi, but he studied Gandhi's methods. And so if you think about Martin Luther King's approaches to fighting for racial equality, he based his protests. He didn't, unlike Malcolm X. Now, it's debatable which approach is better, but it's important to see how people influence each other. So 1850, the British take over India. They do crush the rebellion, but they start a new order, toleration, and civil service, and Indians could participate. But again, they actually introduced elections in 1885, but only 3 million people could participate. So again, people who own property, really not much different from the United States. Now, so from 1858, the British imposed direct rule. When we talk about colonialism, we are going to see 2 forms of colonial rule. One we call indirect rule. So this is where they would use village chiefs and other people to rule the territories. And then there was a direct rule where you had British people doing tax collection, running farms, and so on. And so again, in the Hindi Raj, we see British rule. And so again, they implement what we often call divide and rule. And so the way divide and rule worked is you took the minority group and elevated them over the majority group. In this case, the British take for example, the Dalits. The Dalits are the untouchables. And so they elevate them over the Brahmins. They take the Muslims, who are also the minority, and elevate them over the Hindus, who are the majority. And so it's focusing the anger on the sort of the local group as opposed to the British. So again, the British take over, and Queen Victoria says Britain would no longer attempt to impose our convictions on any of our subjects. And I think that is probably the most ironic statement, because colonialism is imposition of British authority on Indian subjects. And nobody really asked Indians if they wanted the British to rule over them. And so we can, I think, conclude that the 19th century is a time of turmoil and transformation. We see the rise of nation states, but we also see the spread of capitalism and colonialism, but also many, many rebellions. And so these rebellions are showing the existence of marginalized groups. And so they are producing sort of alternative visions to what Europe and North America, especially the United States, are doing. But also the formation of modern states was not necessarily peaceful. In fact, you could say that the modern state was born in violence. Um, and so what I want us to now begin to look at is how so by about 1800s, we begin to see these countries declaring independence. Think of Haiti, for example. Think of the United States. Think of the revolution among the French. The French Revolution creates a new state. So how are these nation states becoming, or how are they becoming organized? Um, what has industrialization done? How has it changed the way people live? And what is the relationship between industrialization and the nation? But also, in this era of the Industrial Revolution, what are the new states that are emerging in Europe, in the United States, or in North America, and so sort of like who are the new imperialists? Because now nations have been formed, well, are being formed. How are they organized? What are they doing? And so this is what we are going to begin to see in thinking about nation building, imperialism, changes in the global map, industrialization, science, and so on. And so some of the questions that we shall be asking ourselves is, what institutions are created in Europe, the Americas, and Japan? How does industrialization, science, and technology affect expanding powerful states? And so think about, for example, weapons. This is an interesting documentary, and I recommend that you watch it sometime, called Guns, Germs, and Steel. Um, so if you think about guns, so for example, Native Americans are using bows and arrows to fight against guns. That's a very uneven fight, not one that anyone is going to win. Germs. We talked about Hernan Cortez and his decimation of the Mayans and using smallpox. So how are diseases affecting people? Then we think about steel. So what is the importance of steel? Steel is used to make ships and to make railways. And so if you think about expansion, so for example, of the United States, it's difficult to think of it without thinking about the railway. And how it opens up the interior. And it's not just the United States. Even in these colonies, we've just seen that in India, the British are building railways in order to facilitate extraction of resources. And then we'll think about more broadly reactions to imperialism in Asia and Africa. Sometimes they were similar, sometimes they were different. Sometimes if the responses were very ineffective. But we also need to talk about other things that we often don't talk about. For example, who built the United States? Would Europeans be wealthy if they did not colonize these places? Think about countries like Portugal or Spain. If they weren't colonial powers, what would they be like? And so we are going to be looking at the period of about 1850 to 1914, when especially European powers build modern states, nation states, but also significantly colonize African and Asian places. We are going to see some of the rivalries. Some of them were based on old disagreements, but there were also newer rivalries. So, for example, if you look at a colonial map of Africa, you will see that the French colonized most of West Africa. And the question is, why? It's not that they were necessarily very effective. In fact, it was almost like an agreement between the Germans and the French. Now, if we go back to the Franco-Prussian War, of 1870, 1871. This is the one where Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, so Napoleon's cousin, decides he's going to create a European empire, and he invades Germany. But then he's defeated by Germany, and so and actually the Germans take one of the French most productive regions of Alsace-Lorraine. And so, instead of the French fighting the Germans are like, well, let's organize a conference where we are going to talk about taking other countries and colonies and other things. And so France gets majority of West Africa. Germany gets a few colonies here and there. So like what was Togo or Dahomey, Cameroon, German Southwest Africa, and German East Africa. And so again, you see these rivalries are intensifying, but they are being resolved by colonizing other people. Now, nationalism go hand in hand with imperialism. In fact, imperialism in some cases causes nationalism. We see an expansion, or the expansion being met with resistance everywhere, but like in the Qing Empire or even in North America, these rebellions are really not successful. And so from about 1914, actually 1884, to about 1985, about a century, most of Africa is colonized. And so we also see Western Europe becoming very powerful in world affairs, not in a very good way, because there's going to be a couple of world wars. And so think about how nationalism is linked to imperialism. So we are Germans, we are great, we are going to conquer other people. And so sometimes history kind of repeats itself. Right now we have been talking about whether we should take Greenland, that is imperialism, whether we should invade Canada or make it the 51st state. Again, that is imperialism. Canada is an independent nation. Panama, should we take over Panama? Maybe. And so we begin to see this consolidation of states, creation of states, specification of what states are. And a lot of these states are built, like most, and I don't know if you ever contemplated this, most people are not necessarily asked if they want to be members of the country that they belong to. Like you find yourself there. One of the interesting phenomena in the world today, you cannot choose to be stateless. Like that is not a choice you can exercise. You have to be a member of some state. Now, your state can fail, for example, Somalia, but you are still a member of a state. I mean, some of us would probably prefer not to be members of any state, but so we are often coerced, but sometimes we agree to be part of a state because we share religions, we share, or also we want to belong to a place that has some order. I think today most of us would not want to go live in Haiti because, the administration of law is a little sketchy. But so we see the building of nation states based on nationalism. So diverse groups are brought together. Regions are accepting of law. So think about Canada, for example, even maybe the United States. There are various diverse ethnic groups, but all are bound by the American statehood. Now, so some of these states had existed for many years. So for example, Switzerland considers itself to have been a country since, I think, 1285 AD. Others are going to be created anew. So for example, Germany and the Kingdom of Prussia become countries in 1871. Italy becomes a country in 1862, even though there were like different Italian principalities and so on. But So this is the period of consolidating nations, creating modern nations, but also creating empires. So nation building and imperialism are interlinked. Some places like Germany, France, the United States, Russia begin to not only consolidate the state, but to go out and conquer people. So, for example, Japan goes out to conquer Korea, it takes Taiwan, and it's trying to take over parts of China. In fact, it creates a country in China that it calls Manchukuo. Um, and so, sort of think about the creation of empires. Now, I point you to the British Empire. So, for example, if you moved from Britain to Canada in like 1850, you are still a British subject, just living in a different place. Or if you move to Australia. So, you see the creation of these empires. But as I mentioned earlier, colonial subjects, the people we found there, so Aborigines, Maoris, Africans, were not members of those nations. And so when these countries actually become independent, there's a question of how do you deal with the issue of citizenship? If you came in and colonized people and you found them there, aren't they necessarily the citizens of that nation? But also we see some challenges to this approach. And one of the most, I think, significant even today is, as I previously mentioned, in Burma. There's an ethnic group called the Rohingyas. So according to the Burmese, people who consider themselves Burmese, the Rohingyas were imported by the British from Bangladesh to work for the British. And so the Burmese do not consider Rohingyas to be members of Burma. And so technically they are stateless, even though they live in Burma or in refugee camps in Bangladesh. And so these are some of the challenges that we begin to see with colonialism. Who belongs to the state? Who decides who belongs to the state? And again, as I mentioned, Native Americans, yeah. Now, when we are building these nations, we are trying to create loyalty to the political institutions. So think about, for example, Native Americans who didn't necessarily have titles to land. And so the idea of private property ownership is newer in that context. But because now the state has been imposed on them, they have to adapt to those new political institutions. And so we see people being assimilated. So, for example, even as Native Americans are moved west, eventually they become something within the American nation. In the US, for example, you may have heard of this idea of manifest destiny, the idea that it was God's will for the United States to expand from shining sea to shining sea. Now, question is that territory wasn't without people, and what happens to those people? Are they asked if they want to become members of this American nation? Actually, they were not asked, and so they lose land, they lose independence, and so eventually they are moved into reservations. And so if you stay with the United States, besides the question of American Indians, there's also the question of slavery. Should new states become, could new states basically have slaves? And so, again, this question is punted to about 1850. And the question, so initially the idea is that they cannot become slave states, but as the United States expands past Missouri into Kansas, the Kansas pro-slavery people are inviting other people, and they're going to have a referendum to decide whether they are going to be a slave state or a free state. And so eventually the US is going to have to fight a civil war over the question of free states and slave states. Now, if you ask Nikki Haley, she will say that the Civil War is about the rights or states' rights, but everybody knows that this Civil War is about slavery. But so again, think about these newly formed states and what they are doing. They're denying African Americans the right to vote. They are trying to expand, and in fact, there's a confederacy that was considered similar. So from Virginia, Mason-Dixon line, all the way to Brazil, those places had more in common than they had with the North. And so, for example, if you think about the US Confederacy, slavery and so on, you think about the Caribbean, those were some of the same economic ideas, the same ideas about race, about the place of the African American. But again, the United States was one union, and so the Civil War was kind of the determinant of what the United States would be. But even after the end of the Civil War, we still see the denial of rights for African Americans using, for example, nuisance codes, Jim Crow, grandfather clauses, in these kind of exclusions of certain subjects within the state are legally allowed. So, for example, think about Plessy v. Ferguson, which kind of reaffirmed, well, it didn't reaffirm Dred Scott v. Sanford because, African Americans had become citizens, but there was still the segregation. But so the question is, what are the new states? Now, you will probably remember this text, which is a text of the 13th Amendment that, in theory, ends slavery. However, there have been people who have argued that slavery is still legal in the United States. Is it or is it not? Apparently, these days we are questioning everything we believe. For example, the 14th Amendment that conferred citizenship to all native or individuals born in the United States and subject to their jurisdiction. And so now the question is, what is subject to their jurisdiction? So, for example, if you're a foreign student here on a visa, are you subject to their jurisdiction or maybe not? Yeah. So, the text of the 13th Amendment, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude. And so this part of except as a punishment. So technically you can be punished to become a slave. It's a terrifying thing to contemplate. So except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. So if a jury decides to convict you to become a slave, theoretically that is legal. But so these are some of the challenges that the new nation finds. We are going to see the expansion of the United States, but also the industrial development of these new nations, including especially the United States. We shall stop here for today.